I'm David Bollier, the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for Renewable Economics. And it's my distinct privilege to introduce our second speaker, Greg Watson. This is actually a difficult challenge because Greg is such an iconoclastic thinker and doer and such an accomplished polymath and pioneer that it really is difficult to distill his very eclectic career and journeys in a short introduction. And maybe I should just make an allusion to his favorite musician, Bob Dylan, who, like Greg, is a self-directed visionary and a serial collaborator on all sorts of fantastic projects. I'm sure Greg would appreciate that plug for Bob. But let's start with the basic facts. Greg is the Director of Public Policy, or Director of Policy and System Design at the Schumacher Center, and his work focuses chiefly on community food systems and the dynamics between local and geo-economic systems. Now, many of you might say, geo-economics, what's that? Well, it's not a term that one hears so often, but you can quickly deduce that it points to the linkage between ecological systems and the human economy known as market capitalism. And as the looming catastrophe of climate change and so many other affiliated environmental problems continues to advance, this is a field of inquiry that we humans, and especially we activists, need to learn a lot more about. Fortunately, Greg has been immersed in this topic for nearly 40 years. He's just the person to help us understand systems thinking and apply that understanding to how we can build a more just and sustainable world. His great early mentor in this project was Buckminster Fuller, the legendary architect, systems theorist, designer, and futurist. Bucky was famous for probing deep design principles of nature and then using them to build such things as electrical grids and housing, among many other things, in ways that are efficient, resilient, and socially equitable. Greg got to know Bucky through the New Alchemy Institute on Cape Cod, an ecological design incubator where Greg worked as education director and then as executive director in the 1980s. The 12 acres of the New Alchemy Institute had organic gardens and sail wing windmills, solar algae ponds, a passive solar greenhouse that hosted one of the first generation aquaponic systems, along with, of course, with the signature geodesic domes that Bucky was famous for. It was the kind of place there where everybody's imagination could run wild, and that's exactly what Greg has done in the intervening years with food and agriculture, urban neighborhoods, ecological design, renewable energy, climate change, and social justice. One of his boldest adventures was to help in reviving the troubled inner city neighborhood of Roxbury, Massachusetts, serving as executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Instead of pursuing the usual models of economic by bringing in, say, a Walmart, he helped catalyze and lead a multicultural grassroots project that established a community land trust to help reclaim some 1,300 largely abandoned acres abandoned lots filled with rubble, and helped bring these back to life as a thriving, sustainable neighborhood in the Boston area through agricultural projects and affordable housing, among other things. So I could go on and on about Greg's amazing career. Let me just mention a few other notable facts. He was served as Massachusetts Commissioner of Agriculture under 3 governors, Dukakis, Weld, and Patrick, during which he helped launch a statewide urban agricultural program and oversaw the planning and construction of the Boston public market. He's organized a network of urban farmers markets in the greater Boston metropolitan area. As the first executive director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust, he's been involved in offshore wind energy development. He's helped promote agroecology in Cuba to help enrich and reclaim agricultural soil. And then, this is an amazing fact to me, in 1988, more than 30 years ago, Greg presented a paper preparing policymakers to address the problems of climate change. This was at the second annual conference of North American Conference of Preparing for Climate Change. So he's been in the vanguard for quite some time. Much of his time today is devoted to developing the World Games Workshop, an idea first proposed by Buckminster Fuller in the 60s that proposes a great logistical non-zero-sum world peace game used as a tool to help solve governance problems. This is really a tantalizing strategy for trying to move us beyond some of the limitations of the nation state in dealing with these problems. So the point, I think, is that Greg has been consistently ahead of his times in the vanguard at the cusp of finding solutions to major societal problems, which is why I'm so eager to hear what he has to share with us today. So I'm thrilled to present Greg Watson.
Okay, thank you, David. I want to make sure you're around to write my obituary. That I think probably to what he was saying is obviously a person that's had a difficult time hanging on to steady employment. But I'm going to talk about global perspective on the Green New Deal. I'm using the Green New Deal because a lot of the work I do is, especially as I start to pursue this concept of the World Games, seems to be a little bit in the stratosphere, and I wanted to be able to ground it in something I think we could all identify with, and something that I think is important with respect to how we can see ourselves becoming involved in this existential threat that climate change is. And the problem with that is a problem or a crisis like climate change can seem at times to be so overwhelming as to be paralyzing. So what we're trying to do, and I think Bucky was, I'm going to refer a lot to Fuller because he changed my life and gave me the self-confidence to pursue a lot of the activities and a lot of the career paths that I've been able to follow. Fuller could have easily been a cult figure. It's very interesting with all the work that he did. The major emphasis, if you really distill what he was trying to do with his efforts in discovering nature's coordinate system and the synergetic geometry and whole systems thinking, was to encourage us all to think for ourselves. It wasn't to think like him, it wasn't to parrot him, but it really was to create a context. He called it explorations in the geometry of thinking. It's about thinking, but thinking for ourselves. And we aren't going to solve global problems if we all parrot or try to mimic someone else. What we need are diversity of ideas and diversity of perspectives, especially when those perspectives are filled, I mean, they always are, I shouldn't say especially when, because they always are fueled by personal experience. And Bucky once said that each one of our lives is a way that the universe could have unfolded. And what he meant by that is, he talked about general principles. He discovered, a general principle, he said, is an eternal principle of nature and of the universe. And someone said, well, how can anyone be so presumptuous as to say that we can discover, or that he has discovered, anything close to an eternal principle? That was really one of his pursuits. Was how does the universe work? How does the world work? What can we learn from observation about principles that are eternal? And he would often respond to folks, and he said, well, you can't do that. And he said, well, I'll state a couple of principles, and all you have to do to disprove that it's not an eternal principle is to show one case or one instance in the history of humanity, written or otherwise, where it's been contradicted. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those, and what he did was sort of try to get at the essence of how the world works. So that's important in terms of us trying to confront. And by the way, some of those would seem, intuition was one of his major tools. And so it seems almost like a contradiction to say that some of the results of his work and some of the results of his thinking are almost counterintuitive. Anyway, how many people are familiar with this image? At least have some idea what it is. All right, so that's good. This is the Dymaxion map, and actually it's sort of referred to it as the one island, one ocean map. It's analogous actually to the image in some ways. I sort of equate it to the image of the Apollo astronauts as they were making their, the first journey to the moon. And it took a couple of, they were on their way and had their cameras pointed to where they were going. And then I think I remember somewhere down at Mission Control, or on Mission Control, not down, but at Mission Control said something like, why don't we turn the cameras and take a look at the Earth. You remember that? And so that's where we got this first photo of the Earth, spaceship Earth, as Bucky called it, but the Earth floating out in space, and it really did impact people greatly in terms of its that sort of one fragile-looking planet surrounded by the darkness and vastness of space. This image, I'd say, is maybe not equally as iconic, but it is iconic because it is the most accurate portrayal we have of the whole Earth at one time, with all the continents spatially oriented correctly and with virtually no distortion. As you know, when trying to, again, transfer or transform the spherical globe to a flat surface like the Mercator maps, we always distortions Greenland, right, almost is bigger than the United States, and so this is important because it's the most accurate picture of the whole Earth that we have. So let's talk a little bit about, I just want to kind of get into the solutions and where we're headed with policy. I'm supposedly the Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I like titles like that because what does that mean? Policy and systems design. Well, it gives me sort of latitude and flexibility to do a lot of things, but I actually am a policy person. I mean, I've worked in government, worked in nonprofits, but I do believe the policy is a powerful tool if it's used correctly and if it's an inclusive process. This is a quote from Naomi Klein, her latest book on fire, The Burning Case for a New Green Deal, and really quickly, and she states, and you can read it, but in the process of transforming the infrastructure of our societies at the speed and scale that scientists have called for to address climate change, humanity has a once-in-a-century chance to fix an economic model that is failing the majority of people on multiple fronts. And so I guess this is both a statement and a bit of a question. You could say obviously the banner, and this is the posters, we need a new Green Deal. Some might say, do we need a new Green Deal? But I guess the question I'm putting forward is, can the Green New Deal be the real deal? Does it have the substance? Is it something that is crafted? And by the way, I realize there's more than one Green New Deal proposal floating around there. There's obviously, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's, and then Bernie's is out there, and they're in essence, and I'll get to that, are basically trying to address some same major goals. I was at Bioneers out in San Rafael, California, last weekend, and I had lunch with the director of an organization that I wasn't aware existed. It's called New Consensus. And it's a group that has, I think, I'm not sure it's the only one, but it's one of the organizations that has come into being, I believe in this case with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's sort of blessing to actually begin drafting in greater detail the Green New Deal. It's called New Consensus. I love the byline here because it raises a lot of questions for me. It says the world needs a new worldview, and it certainly does. But here's the mission, or not the mission, it's a statement. And just take a couple of minutes, and I probably have too many words put up on the screen, but it does talk about a truly beautiful world as possible, one without poverty or pollution, and prosperity and dignity for everyone. There's other stuff there, but that sort of is a bold, grand statement, probably a little not your characteristic kind of government statement. It's a vision. And as you'll see a little later, it's very close to the vision of that Bucky states in terms of the goals for the Rogaine workshops. So here, again, too many words, you don't have to read them all, but I just really wanted to say, in general, what are the primary, the span and scope of the Green New Deal? What is it attempting to do? And what is it attempting at least to address? And without going to each of the details, but emissions, power use, meeting all U.S. power demand through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. Keep that in mind. I always say both the devil and the angels are in the details. And I think one of the things that if we're really serious about coming up with solutions or addressing climate change. And I keep saying addressing because we're in the midst of climate change. And I think it's clear what we're trying to do is to avoid the worst case scenario. I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think, my colleague Paul Hawken, at least with some of his efforts, would say that in addition to doing some of the things that are listed here, his effort, as you know, with the drawdown project, and you have to commend him for taking this step because I think it's a bold step to say that we've got to look for ways of pulling as much, many of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere, pull them out of the atmosphere and get them out there so that maybe there can be there's an opportunity or hope for more mitigation than some people would otherwise admit to. But so it's power usage, there's agriculture, and agriculture plays, again, and most of these they're two-way streets. Agriculture is a source of a lot of the problem, greenhouse gas emissions, but it can also be, as Sally pointed out, can also be a big part of the solution. Infrastructure, jobs, and then I think the part that sometimes people start to sort of say, well, why are you taking this much broader look at this and including the idea of welfare and social justice? Is that necessary? Is that relevant? Does that in any way dilute sort of this effort of talking about mitigating or addressing climate change when you start to add in these issues of social justice and welfare? And I think it's, I'll address that because I think, one of the things that differentiates climate change from the original New Deal, let me say the Green New Deal from the old New Deal is, well, there are many distinctions, obviously, but I think the one that is most obvious is that the original New Deal was addressing a crisis and a problem that was pretty much felt by it was there, and it was felt across the board, and people were suffering. It was not an existential threat that was sort of, and even though I think we are feeling its impact today, it's dispersed, it's disparate, it comes in different times. People can sometimes, because there's the fires are put out or the heat spell ends, people can sort of say, maybe that wasn't climate change. When you were in the heart of the Depression, there was no question you're in the heart. You're in the heart of it. So that was a real and present crisis. It was a challenge for democracy. Democracy was really imperiled in terms of its people questioning democracy's ability, that is our form of government, liberal government, the different branches of government, really being able to come together, put aside partisan politics, and actually deal with this type of problem. I think you can hear those same concerns expressed today, right? I mean, well, it's not even concerns, we can see it every day, unfortunately, that we can't pull ourselves together to even deal with the manufactured crises that are out there. But there were at times, I think there were folks in the FDR administration that were actually consulting with legal and constitutional experts, wondering if there was a constitutional pathway to authoritarianism. Because there was a feeling that if democracy failed, that the whole country could fall apart. So it was very serious business in terms of what was being addressed at that time. Questions about the new consensus, the questions that, and somebody coming up with a plan, any plan, even the new Green Deals, I would just have to ask myself these questions. I don't know if you can read that, but one is, who is developing this new worldview? What assumptions underlie it? Whatever this worldview, is it a political worldview? Is it a scientific worldview? Where do we get a chance to provide any input? One thing that I ran into at the conference I was in California, I had to, well, I didn't have to, I volunteered, I agreed to chair some panel discussions. One was on the Green New Deal, and it was very stimulating, round table. And I got pulled aside afterwards, in between sessions. That's where everything happens, by a number of people, very different perspectives. A senior planner in Portland, Oregon, African American community, organizers, health advocates, and they all had the same question. It came to me only because I was chairing the panel and probably thought I knew more than but certainly assumed that I knew more than I did. But the question that they all asked was, how do we get involved in this? Do we have are there any avenues or opportunities for any input? Will there be hearings, right? And by the way, these concerns were not raised necessarily in any critical context. They all felt that they had something to offer. We're doing things that are working, and is there any way that we can inform the process so that a couple things, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you can learn from some on-the-ground experience that are actually working, and no one could quite see where there might be avenues to do that. The other question that I always would raise is, what are all the options available to us, and how are that are drafting these types of policies? In this case, very critical, important policy. How do you know that you have and you are exploring as many options as you can? I mean, that was one of the big things about Bucky and his thinking. And some people didn't quite get this. He says when he starts to think of a problem, he says, "I always start with the universe." And people say, "What do you mean start with universe?" And he says, "I start the universe, and then I whittle my way down, discarding all the macro irrelevancies, and then I get closer, and then I start to discard the micro irrelevancies, but I don't want to leave anything out. So if you start with the universe, you've got everything included, and then you finally whittle your way down to the core issues that are relevant to what you're to the problem that you're trying to solve." I know that may sound weird, but I do that every time I try to solve a problem, and it actually does work. What are the implications of the proposed action? Have you had a chance or what mechanism, what process have you put in place that gives you a sense that you've thought this through and you understand what those implications are? And then finally, given that vision they talked about, again, an equitable world, a beautiful world, is that world even possible? I think that we do indeed need a new worldview. I think that the good news is that we have a head start on it. And if you take the lesson, or at least the headline from this Guardian article, which was just written a few weeks ago, it basically says, and this is near and dear to my heart, obviously, because I spent a number of years at the New Alchemy Institute, and they talked about the creation of the living machines, all the research projects on renewable energy, sustainable architecture, and the question they pose is that these eco-pioneers design a blueprint for the future. And if you're asking me that, the answer is going to be clearly they did, and it had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with people like Dr. John Todd and Bill McClarney and Nancy Jack Todd, the three co-founders of New Alchemy, which was an organization that was founded in the 70s, and really pretty much at the time, right around the time of the first Earth Days. And a time when we were and by the way, those are times when youth were out in the streets and we were protesting and we were challenging the status quo. I think the thing that the Todds and McClarney did, and by the way, John and Bill were marine biologists. They were both PhDs in marine biology, working at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the renowned research organizations in the world. But they just said, somebody's got to start, and you take the initiative, right? Someone has to start working on the alternatives. It's great to point out what the problems are and why they're problems: fossil fuels, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. But at some point, we've got to start to address, we have to start building a better model. That's what Bucky would say, is you don't challenge. The best way to really sort of address the problems of the world is to create a better model. And so this was an amazing place. As mentioned before, pioneering work. I think, in many cases, and we're not alone, by the way. Rodale, there were a number of other organizations. Rocky Mountain Institute was doing the work in renewable energy, but it was a pretty heady time when people were researching, and this was like, an incredible amalgam of hippies and scientists and poets and artists who were coming together to try to come up with these solutions. The key to it was that nature provided the model for most of the designs. And I mean that quite literally. This was sort of biomimicry at its height. I just mentioned some of the things here. David actually beat me to the punch in his introduction in pointing out some of the main accomplishments at the time. Here's one point I want to point out. Fuller also pointed out that new ideas, innovations, have a gestation period. And he actually understood that different industries have different, that is, the period in which a new idea actually gets incorporated, whether it's into an industry or into society. And industries, each industry has its own sort of gestation period. Aeronautics is one of the fastest, where a new and a good idea can get incorporated within a couple of years, 3 years. The building construction trade is the slowest, 25 to 50 years for a new idea or innovation to sort of make its way. When I was at the New Alchemy Institute, we actually renovated an old barn. We turned it into, I think, one of the country's first super insulated buildings. No central heating system, air-to-air heat exchangers and Tyvek, and we presented, made a presentation to the Building Trades Association on Cape Cod. A number of people got up and walked out. They looked at this stuff and said, "What is this Tyvek? What are you talking about?" And they just stormed out of the meeting. And that was, again, indicative of the fact that a resistance, but it was almost like an industrial cultural resistance, not so much individual but really sort of coming at it from a phenomenon that Fuller, and I think now a bunch of others, are starting to observe and say, how many of those trends and how many of those patterns can we pick up? Because as you start to understand that, you get a better sense of how to address problems. You get a better sense of what the culture you're trying to deal with accepts or rejects, and it's not, in some cases, how you can maybe circumvent that process. So as we were rethinking technology at places like New Alchemy Institute, Rocky Mountain Institute, there were folks, obviously, E.F. Schumacher, Bob Swan, and others who were doing the same thing and rethinking economics. And there's no question that Small is Beautiful, Economics of People Mattered, seminal book in terms of getting, and both of these sort of activities did a lot in terms of, I think, emboldening people, because I think at least I know, it wasn't common for people to think that you could actually question science. You could question economics. Most people didn't understand economics. Maybe most economists didn't understand economics, I still think. But you didn't question that, because they were, for all intents and purposes, they were givens, and you accepted them. But I think, with books like Small is Beautiful, and with activities and experiences, as David mentioned, and Jane Jacobs, by the way. Jane Jacobs probably, and again, Jane Jacobs made clear what my second favorite philosopher meant when he said, that second favorite philosopher being Yogi Berra, you can observe a lot by looking. And Jane Jacobs was a great observer. And she walked the streets of New York, and she saw what was going on, the dynamics of cities and city life. And she understood the importance of preserving local neighborhoods, and she had the guts to stand up against people like Robert Moses, right, the big developers in New York City, and she wrote some amazing books herself, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, and and then you have a group of just a community like the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, poor African American, white, Cape Verdean, Latino residents victimized by redlining, disinvestment, racism, arson for profit, as David pointed out, reducing their community to rubble, and then for them to have the vision to understand, and part of that was because of consultation with folks here at Schumacher, Bob Swan and Susan Witt, understanding probably more than I think even some of the academics and people who were experts in this, the real power of a community land trust. And without dwelling too much on that, because I want to get to it, make sure I don't, but I think, they understood that building community wealth was an important process, and their economics says that they they realized that they had to some extent, sacrifice maximizing individual wealth to build community wealth, which in the end really helped everyone. And it was just a different way of looking at economics that most economists will tell you, and even some of the foundations. The Ford Foundation was a little reticent about giving us a grant because they said, the people don't own the land. You're taking away their opportunity to build wealth. And they proved them wrong on that account. So we're questioning science, technology, questioning math, the economics. And we also think we have to rethink globalism. And I think whether, people say, well, globalism it's a bad thing, it's gone awry, and we can't participate in that. But as I say, anybody, as long as we all carry these around, among other things, right? We have these, globalization is a reality. Because the components of our electronics, our consumer electronics, and I'm going to, as I point out in a little bit, our renewable energy technologies that are on the drawing board as being part of the solution to the problem have now become inextricably part of a global supply chain. And there's possibility, even as we think, and this is, again, as Hazel Henderson pointed out in the article, we really do have to do everything we can to understand what it means to think globally and act locally, and as I would say, and vice versa. Because I don't know how you do otherwise. So let me then sort of segue into the Rogaine workshop. The subtitle of this, what we're trying to do with the World Game is is revitalizing. I'll talk about what that is in just a second, but a concept that Bucky developed. We actually feel honored. I'm working with a woman named Elizabeth Thompson, who was former executive director of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and she was also the founder and director of the Buckminster Fuller Challenge. And that was an annual $100,000 award that was given, a grant that was awarded to, part of a competitive grant process for proposals that were meeting basic human needs, solving a major problem, using the overall design science approach that Fuller developed. We feel that part of the World Game is to look for those solutions, but we also feel it's got to be a tool for improving what we're calling global systems literacy, our understanding of how global systems work and our relationship with that world. Remember, so the goal of the World Game workshops is to, and this is important because to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Think that's possible? Most people, no, I say, because most people would say, absolutely, how are we going to do that? Is that possible? Here's what I would say, and to that point, you can Google, and somebody challenge me and email me if you find it afterwards, but go onto Google, take a look, search, and see if there's any other organization or institution anywhere, as you Google, that is trying to make the world work for 100% of humanity, and by doing it without ecological offense and disadvantage of anyone, and you won't find it. So what Bucky would say is, look to see what needs to be done that no one else is doing that you think you may have the ability to do, and do it. And it doesn't mean you're going to find anybody who's going to pay for it, but you should try it anyway. So let me just sort of say, and this is the centerpiece of this, is the Dymaxion map, and I think that is the map I mentioned before, no distortions, and he invented this map and actually patented the map. Which shows again that it was, and the other part about this map is that when you look at this, not only are there no distortions, but no country or no area has a privileged position. You could flip it around and nothing would change, but it also just shows you, again, sort of a different relationship. And you can almost see, remember Pangea, at least the original, all the continents were one big glob, and so we were one major continent and it sort of broke apart. But as you can see from this, what the dynamics and map shows, that we are still connected. And instead of us being one major continent, we're sort of now a necklace, which is sort of important in terms of looking at some of the opportunities that we have. So the Rogaine global simulation has, mentioned it before, got off track, but Elizabeth and I, working through the Schumacher Center, we've been actually blessed with being given the ability to steward the reimagining of what the Rogaine workshop could be, and particularly in this time of global crisis, we feel that a tool like this is important. So before going any further, maybe I'm looking out at the audience, and since there's a lot of gray out there, but also a lot of non-gray, I'm not sure that everybody understands sort of who Buckminster Fuller was, other than maybe people know him as the inventor of the geodesic dome and the person who would give 24-hour lectures about everything that he knew, and he did that. And I went to one and was glued, and I tell you. But he was a cartographer, mathematician, inventor, poet. He was a polymath. One of the things I like about him most is that he was kicked out of Harvard twice, and once because I think, well, I won't go into that. But anyway, but he learned his understanding of whole systems did not come from academia, but it came from serving in the military, serving in the Navy. And in World War I, he understood that if you're on a ship and you've got to know everything you can about what is on that ship, how it's equipped, what's there in terms of your life support, and you also have to know everything you can about the environment that ship is operating in if you want to survive. And that led him to sort of this perspective of whole systems, but it did not come sort of through academia. So he's written a number of books, had a number of inventions, including the Epcot dome that was at Expo in '67. He also developed a Dymaxion car during the Depression that could see, I think, up to 15 people that could get 60, 70 miles 100 miles to the gallon. It had three wheels, could pivot on one wheel. He was a designer in the extreme. And it wasn't, even the geodesic dome was not necessarily something that he envisioned would necessarily be used by everyone, but it demonstrated some very important principles. And all he wanted to do was to demonstrate, among other things, that spheres, obviously, if you're talking about affordable, it was designed to address a housing crisis in a world with exploding population. What do you want to do? You have to figure out, and this is sort of the mantra, how do you do more with less? And a sphere, you all remember this from our geometry, right? Is the shape or the structure that encloses the maximum amount of volume using the least amount of surface area to do it. You can't enclose space any more efficiently than with a sphere. But spheres are kind of also a little bit unstable, so he triangulated the sphere. Triangles actually enclose the least amount of area, but using the most surface area to do it, and tetrahedra. But if you integrate the two, what you get is a very efficient, lightweight structure. And remember the picture of the dome, we took about 20 people, could pick one up, set it down, reestablish it, put it cinder block foundation, and it could withstand hurricane force winds. And so we know how to do some things. And he sort of designed in sort of those extremes so that we could see. But Synergetics, by the way, Synergetics was his major work. It's a very difficult book, but it really encapsulates what he described as his discovery and articulation of nature's coordinates. It's an incredible, fascinating book. It's geometry. But here's what I will tell you. It's a book where you can understand the principles of biology and ecological design, and I dare say even Einstein's theory of relativity, but you don't need abstract mathematics. He felt that the whole idea of this initiation into the scientific world through algebraic calculus and abstract mathematics that people couldn't sort of quite comprehend was a way to sort of keep a closed fraternity. So his attempt, and by the way, by no means does this mean that this is not a difficult book to read. It's because of his use of language, but even his use of language was precise. He would invent, as my friend Deb reminded me just 2 minutes ago, that he was more than 2 seconds because I've been up here a long time. But you know what I'm saying. But he used language in a way that forced you to think, not reflex. And what would happen if you really put the effort into reading it, I can't speak for you, I, for the first time, understood what it meant to really understand something that was vitally important. And in fact, I was convinced that I had come to understand some eternal principles of universe. There, I said it, right. Eternal principles of universe. So Synergetics, here's what, I am going to read this, it's big, but you grope for analogies. The Notebook of Leonardo, the Opera of Paracelsus, Pascal's Pensée, or Alexander Pope's remark about creation, quote, a mighty maze, but not without a plan. It is alternately brilliant and obscure, opaque and shot through with moments of poetry. What becomes clear with patience is that the virtues and liabilities are one. Synergetics could not have been written in any other way because its language and mathematics are vehicles for vision. And that was the New York Times, 1975, New York Times Book Review. So this is nature's coordinate system that Bucky challenged. Talk about challenging mathematics. You know that, X, Y, Z, everything going on to infinity. Bucky said, I don't think nature works that way. He says, I think nature works in closed systems. And there's another way to see intersecting planes that have the same angular orientation, not 90 degrees, but 60 degrees. And he called this the vector equilibrium, and he said it was nature's operating system. You can't take my word for that, I realize that, but this is from Morse-Klein, Mathematics, Loss of Certainty. I'm going to make sure I get this. But anyway, mathematical creation of the early 19th century, strange geometries, strange algebras, forced the mathematicians reluctantly to grudgingly to realize that mathematics proper and the mathematical laws of science were not truths. Apparently, mathematical design was not inherent in nature, or if it was, man's mathematics was not necessarily the account of that design. What was synergetics? So I believe, not me, but Buckminster Fuller discovered and articulated the nonlinear logic of the structural mathematics of nature, what he called nature's coordinate system and synergetics. Triangular tetrahedral system that employs 60-degree coordination rather than 90-degree coordinate system. And what you then begin to see is you see it articulated. There are things, this is closest packing of spheres. It's the way he thinks nature coordinates. With the Cartesian coordinates, you've got infinity. You can start pollution can go out to somewhere because it's a wide open system. This system has feedback, and you can kind of see how it goes. And it's also scalable. I mean, this doesn't do it justice, but I think you can see, obviously, there's that form and function become sort of integrated in real ways. Nature is beautiful not because it has ornamentation that was put there just to make it look pretty, because nature is totally functional. And the total functionality of nature then emerges as, in our eye, and I think as beauty, because it's designed right. Design may be anthropomorphic, but at least that's what I'm going to use that. So I would say dare to be naive. And war games, which is the Bucky Fuller's World Game Workshops, were designed as a direct counterpoint to war games. War games are linear. They are analytical games that are used to obviously create opportunities to play out strategic situations and to, with the ultimate goal of defeating adversaries. World game uses, and by the way, I should point out, that's using data and information from around the world in terms of resources, in terms of trends, in terms of population, in terms of what's going on in the world, and you use that, and that becomes part of your inventory for developing a strategic defense strategy. Rogaine uses that same information. This is important. He said, what would happen if you or I had that same information, the same data, and could use that instead of developing weapons? We've put that to the use of solving human needs for everyone aboard Spaceship Earth. He said if that happens, World Game does make it eminently clear that we have 4 billion billionaires aboard our planet as accounted by real wealth, which is a fact which he says has been obscured by our traditional economic system. And by real wealth, his definition is real wealth is the technological ability to protect, nurture, and support the needs of life. It's not making money. It's really, are we enhancing and building and nurturing and supporting life support? And real wealth is a product of energy times intelligence, energy turned into artifacts that advantage human life. Wealth being a human concept. I mean, this is we're not saying, so it is about building that piece. So quickly, before I'm going to get to climate change and renewable energy, spent a number of years, 1989, I did go to that conference in 1988, created something called the Mass Office of Science and Technology. One of our first publications was on climate change, worked with the Renewable Energy Trust, and had Massachusetts by default became the U.S. Leader, not leader, that's the wrong word because we didn't do that as well, but we became the first place where offshore wind energy development started to be developed. And William Hieronymus, who's a University of Massachusetts professor, was the first to identify the offshore wind resource as being enough to supply electricity for the entire world. And he was the first person to start to design floating platforms. So here we are now, and the good news, look at renewables. I mean, renewable power prices are now lower than the cost of natural gas. I think it's like approaching coal. Bill McKibben is quickly to point that out. He points out the cost of solar is actually going down too, and there are calls for stopping fossil fuels, build 100% renewables. Yes, but. And it's the but. We've got to start to realistically say, what is that? What are the buts? Rogaine workshops, where, again, we've inherited this from the past. We're going to update this, offers a series of real-time, data-driven, immersive educational experiences. And so we want to illuminate global system dynamics and start to say, can we take a look at these proposals and sort of assess or evaluate their ability to do what they say they are designed to do. And just really quickly, I'm going to get to the end of here, but so some of the things we look at are world resources. That was one of the keys for Fuller. What are those resources? Now I'm going to do my geeky thing, right? Sally did her geeky thing. Mine is a periodic table, which I love. And the periodic table is nature's minimum inventory, maximum diversity toolkit for creating everything, right? I mean, they didn't tell us that. They sort of told us that in chemistry, but you can't. Everything in nature, in the natural world, is built from either the elements or some combination of those elements, which were born where? In stars. We are of stardust, right? Nova explosions, and so those are the elements. But they also the toolkit for everything that we make in society. So I love this illustration because it shows you the chemical elements, but it also kind of gives you an indication of what they're used for, why they're important, what their economic value is. And by the way, that economic value varies over time. It varies with the development of technologies that use them, right? Cobalt, a few years ago, cobalt, little red dye, nobody talked about cobalt. And all of a sudden with our smartphones and all, cobalt markets are soaring because of technological development. Here's the most important thing is that those elements, those minerals are distributed unevenly around the world. That's and again, how does you interpret that from nature's point of view, that uneven distribution of elements and minerals leads to diversity, right? Different plants, different flora and fauna are in different parts of the world because they have the different sort of mineral or element contents to support them or not support them. In the case, I apologize for this, but in the case of renewable energy, wind turbines, solar panels, all rely on a vast array, a combination of chemical elements and minerals. And as you can see, or maybe can't see from here, but even if you look at offshore wind, you can see that where they get many of, and these are sort of the key down, the log down here shows you what elements are being used, but and shows you that they're sourced from many different parts of the world. China being a major source, and you probably heard about the rare earth element. Everybody's heard about rare earth elements now, but in some cases they come from places, cobalt from Congo, 54%, I think of that, and those are conflict nations in some cases. So there are logistical, economic, ethical, moral issues now that are a result of us developing these new technologies that can in fact have the potential for addressing climate change, but we will be remiss if we don't understand that there are a lot more implications than sort of meet the eye. But in addition to resources, we are looking at technologies and technology development, because as I mentioned, technologies in many cases define what minerals or elements are important. But here's what I want to do here is that the original Green New Deal leading up to the Second World War, one of the areas that it focused on, and one of the things that the new Green Deal focuses on, is research and development. And if you look at our today's economy, and you realize that, and this is important, that pretty much nearly all of the core technologies that characterize the digital age came from military R&D labs. And again, we are, for the most part, recipients. Our economy in particular, over the years, has been driven by obsolete military technologies or outdated or replaced military technologies and which is unfortunate is that the graphic that didn't show up in the top there are the major companies like Halliburton and some of the large corporations that then take those no longer classified technologies and say, how can we introduce these into the economy? Not to meet human needs, but to make money, make a lot of money. And so you realize that there's a little bit of there's a skewing there in terms of what would happen if the focus of R&D programs really were to try to address human needs instead of sort of lining the pockets of some of these major corporations. By the way, the other day when I had to get a few months ago, when I got my airbag replaced in my car, I got a rental, and it was a brand new car, and I get into it, and all of a sudden I'm saying, is this thing out of control? I'm getting jerked around, and I never driven. My car's old. I don't have the new, but it was equipped with all the new accessories that are part of the field test that the military is developing for their autonomous vehicles, right? We really are sort of field testing that technology. The military has identified the next arena for a major war is going to be mega cities. And they've determined that the way those wars are going to be fought will be with autonomous vehicles and drones and facial recognition technologies. And so as they're developing them, we get them sort of said, and maybe we love them, maybe they, the lane change things and all but in essence, what they are the technologies that are being developed for the next phase of warfare in those areas. So I'm going to end really quickly, but it's sort of, what Bucky advocated was sort of, again, transferring and replacing technologies for weaponry to technologies for livingry, and what might it look like if we had an R&D budget that went to things like eco-designs or floating offshore wind farms or soil carbon sequestration, electric vehicles would be sort of important. I'm going to get near the end here and talk about human needs and trends. We need to find out what's going on in the world that might affect us, and that might give us, as Sally mentioned, some surprises about maybe where some of the solutions are. And so making the invisible visible, looking at supply chains. How many folks have probably by now heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road in China? In fact, Belt and Road is the largest infrastructure project in the history of, at least we know, ever undertaken. Just really quickly, it involves 69 countries, 60% of the world's population, and talking about nearly $1 trillion in projected investments. I think the key is that it's loaded with a lot of things, but it is investment in infrastructure. And I think it's a little distinguished between, that's the way the U.S., when we talk about, aid to other countries, it's usually in the form of in many things, but certainly in almost designed for regime change. And I'm not saying this isn't, I'm going to be very careful here, but infrastructure investment makes sense, and countries can benefit and it's a tangible result. Now, China gets a lot in return for that, right? Because they get access to things like ports because they're helping to build those ports and railroads, which also has strategic importance. So everything is at least I would say double-edged, if not multi-edged sword. But this is what's going on. I only point this out to say that it's coming. The thing, because of the supply chain work, it's really from an operational and functional point of view with these 60 countries that are participating in it, the whole notion of nation-state boundaries is almost being dissolved. They don't matter as much because they're interconnected. As China is building the railroads, the highways, and the ports, and the airports, they're developing among these 69 countries the standards, the engineering standards that they're all using. So they're creating this different type of network and this different type of interdependency. Some people, if you're a critic, you will say it's a dependency or interdependency. But one of the things they're also developing is a global energy interconnection. They're proposing to connect the world with one integrated electric grid, modular but integrated electric grid. And the reason for that, or at least ostensibly, and you can sort of understand it, is that they see China's positioning itself to become leader in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and recognizing that they're making probably the best play to convert the transportation sector to electricity. The bonus, the incentives they provide for buying electric vehicles, they're developing their network of recharge stations across the continent, and they're pulling together Eurasia, but they realize that they're trying to see if it's possible to make renewable energy a base load, a steady and reliable source, not just intermittent. And the way that they see doing that is connecting different regions around the world, because someplace the wind is always flowing, the sun is always shining, high voltage, direct current transmission now allows for the long range transmission of that electricity. And so they have this vision of really creating this continent, that particular project. I want to point out that during the Carter administration, Bucky Fuller approached Jimmy Carter and Premier Trudeau and Brezhnev of the USSR with an idea that he said, I think you should pursue. And it was I presented my plan for using our increasing technical ability to construct high voltage superconductive transmission lines and implement an around the world electrical energy integrating the daytime and nighttime hemispheres, thus swiftly increasing the operating capacity of the world's electric energy system and living standard in an unprecedented feat of international cooperation. So he sort of saw this as that spontaneous cooperation that would sort of bring countries together. And it's sort of interesting that you've got a Western visionary way out there, Buckminster Fuller, and authoritarian, repressive regime, China, but they've reached the same conclusion about the viability and at least the importance of trying to take this track. So I'm going to end by saying, they can envision, as the world game, we might start asking the workshop a number of questions. Could you envision a model of global cooperation to address climate change? Could you chart its critical path? Could you support a China-led world electric grid? Could you articulate an alternative? We want to use this as a way of getting at some of those thorny questions. I don't know how else. By the way, the point I really want to make with that is that may be the only way that we can actually meet the demands of the resource demands for renewable energy without exhausting them, because of the cooperation. You're going to be using those resources much more efficiently. If everybody goes their own way, we tried to do a community wind project in Massachusetts, and we realized that was going to eat up a lot of resources if everybody was going to develop their own. Now, that doesn't rule out, by the way, it doesn't say microgrids and local grids can't work, because again, they can be modularly designed and they may not all be renewable. But I don't see how we're going to get around this conundrum of we can't. I almost forgot this point. I am going to end this, but I almost forgot the point that the other reality that we have to face is that renewable energy technologies, the wind, the solar, it is part of an extractive industry. I mean, we say, no, we're no longer going after oil and gas, and so we're going to close those mines and we're not extracting. If you're going to rely on solar and wind, you are extracting. And so we've got to start, we have to be honest about that. And we've got to start, my prediction is you're going to start seeing phrases like, can there be sustainable extraction? Or what, I'm not being facetious here, but something has got to happen because we're not being honest. And I don't care if you need that minute amount of whatever it is, right? Cobalt or whatever, you still got to go into the mines to get it. And now they're talking about mining right under the ocean. And you've got this conflict now going on in the Arctic as it starts to melt. So let me end by saying you never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. That doesn't mean you reach utopia. It probably means you're going to reach more difficult problems. One island, one ocean, one Earth. Thank you.